So, Tom,
Emily.
we're actually nearing Christmas now, or certainly nearing Christmas shopping time.
Mm-hmm.
I have been thinking about what we might get for producer Ben for Christmas. Let me tell you, I've got this t-shirt. It's very sleek, minimalist, printed with upcycled CO2 emissions. Captured carbon printed on the front of the t-shirt. It's pretty nice.
That sounds nice. I feel like Ben's a bit lower key than that though. Maybe he wouldn't want something that's just right there in your face.
Yes. Other options. If he's fancy getting a bit arty, I could see this up in his house, judging on his background over Zoom. There's a beautiful print of Cooling the Climate Apocalypse made from captured carbon, printed beautiful colours, captured carbon. I mean, why not?
Mm-hmm. Anything more practical?
Crayons, so he can make his own art.
Okay. Here's one, a big one, an expensive one.
Oh, go on.
Diamonds.
Oh, God. We'd have to do quite a whip around, I think, if we wanted to get Ben that for Christmas.
But yeah, diamonds made from captured CO2.
If we wanted to show our love and appreciation for producer Ben, why the hell not? Let's go wild.
Hello, welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show. I'm Tom.
And I'm Emily. Welcome to episode 6. Today we're going to be talking about carbon marketplaces and carbon utilisation.
Okay, so over the last few episodes, we've looked into the plethora of nature-based and engineered solutions that are out there for drawing down carbon from the air.
And something that has become increasingly clear as we've gone through this subject is that doing all of this costs money. Nothing is free in this world, and carbon removal isn't even cheap most of the time. We know that the need to remove carbon is vital. But in our current economic system, there needs to be a financial incentive to do so.
Exactly. And I think it's fair to say that the solutions which offer the safest and the most permanent carbon removal also tend to be the most expensive, or at least have those higher upfront costs. Thinking back to biochar, Emily, you wanted to do your own biochar facility in your back garden, right?
I did.
Unless you're a secret millionaire, something tells me that you're probably not going to be setting up a DAC facility in your back garden, although I would love to see you try.
Yeah, I don't have any secret millions in my back pocket, but when I do, I don't even have a garden right now, actually, but when I get a garden and all my millions, I'm going to set up every kind of carbon removal. I suppose actually the same is true for trees to a certain extent. You need land, which is the expensive part, and actually years of caretaking and maintenance of those trees, which, when you're storing carbon underground is not something you have to consider. It's just down there and done.
So in that sense, DAC followed by geological storage would end up being cheaper in the long run. It's one and done. We're not paying to renew carbon credits again and again and again, which is what you may do with tree planting.
Yeah, exactly. So actually we're talking about price per year. Sort of the storage rate is higher. Or if you imagine you are a ton of carbon, you're going to have to pay higher rent to live in a tree than you would to live down an old oil well, which actually makes a lot of sense because it seems much nicer to live in a tree, so no wonder the rent's high. But the point of this episode is that in the real world, those tons of carbon, they don't have any money or bank accounts or credit score or any of that. So where does the money come from to pay their rent? I mean, they could live in our atmosphere rent-free, but we really don't want that. So I guess we have to pay the rent on their new digs.
You certainly got into that metaphor and you've taken me in all different directions. But the big question is, regardless of how expensive or cheap your process is, how is anyone going to make money from carbon removal? And so in this episode, we're going to be looking at 2 ways in which we can reimagine this captured carbon as a commodity. We're going to be asking this question: is our economy set up to incentivize these initiatives? And if it isn't, then how are we going to get there?
In reality, either governments are going to have to invest a lot of money in this, or businesses are going to have to find a way to make money from this.
Or both.
Or both.
Now, we've spoken to a lot of experts in the making of this series, and something they all come back to regularly is this idea of taking carbon that's been removed and putting it out there in the market and selling it.
Just like any marketplace for any commodity, carbon marketplaces rely on supply and demand. We've discussed all different kinds of ways of supplying it, making that carbon available. But where does the demand come from?
Very good question. And there are industries that require a supply of carbon to actually manufacture something. And we'll get into that in a minute. But right now, what we're going to get into is the world of carbon credits. We've mentioned credits before, this idea of purchasing a promise of 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. That's a removal credit. Or the promise of avoiding 1 ton being emitted. And those are avoidance credits.
You may have also heard about voluntary and mandatory or compliance marketplaces. There is so much that we could go into on those mandatory markets and the policies behind them, but there's a whole series in that. So today we're going to focus on voluntary markets as a way of understanding all those different things that are going on in a carbon marketplace.
Yes, and I'm really excited about voluntary carbon markets.
We spoke with Sophie Purdom, the co-founder of Climate Tech VC. Sophie started her own climate business a few years ago, and she now invests in early-stage companies. She explained to us why marketplaces are so important for carbon removal businesses.
Fundamentally, CDR relies on this premise of there being a carbon market. And that's a big leap for anybody, and especially institutional investors, to wrap their head around and be willing to back. Now, I think that's changing moment to moment. In large part, it's obviously a policy shift, but you can't ever really, or a good investor shouldn't necessarily bet on regulatory risk. The big piece that the investors can bet on is a shift in demand driven by corporates standing up, raising their hand, and being willing to announce that they're going to purchase early removals from some of these still early stage CDR companies. And that structurally changes the market completely, right? Now there's a customer. And when there's a customer, the investors are willing to bankroll out of the gate. All of a sudden there's competition, et cetera, et cetera. The market kind of goes.
Yeah, I suppose we were thinking, without successful carbon removal businesses, there is no carbon removal. And I think from what Sophie's saying, we could extend that to without that thriving marketplace with sellers and buyers, there is no confidence of income, there is no investment interest, there is no carbon removal.
Yeah, you're not going to invest in something that doesn't have a customer, unless you have to. And so we started looking at this question of demand, and what exactly is driving demand for carbon removal credits. A big factor is the growing swathes of climate pledges and net zero promises that are coming from countries and companies around the world.
And that's where these kind of two types of CDR technologies come in. One is atmospheric ambient air removal technologies that pull from highly diluted air stock and take that CO2 out of the air that you and I are breathing in. And then the other category are point source CDR technologies that will pull from a more concentrated flue, for example, or factory where the concentration of CO2 is much higher than what's in ambient air. And I think that they will have different marketplaces and buyers at the end of the day. So the point source buyer is easier to wrap your head around. It's essentially those point sources are operated by entities today. So cement factories or oil and gas facilities or steel manufacturers or anywhere where there's a lot of CO2 coming out the flue. The reason they are incentivized to do that is maybe pending regulation, but also institutional investors, again, pushing down top to bottom, kind of requiring decreasing carbon footprint. On the other side, it's going to be a different type of buyer that wants to kind of for the good of humanity in some ways, rip the existing ambient air of its greenhouse gases. Now, that buyer, from an economic perspective, would want to do that more or less to offset some of their own emissions that they can't reduce through operations. There's always going to be something that's too expensive or more expensive technically than ambient air removals, right? Such that it makes more sense to pay for the ambient air removals.
And this momentum is also driving investors. Here's Sophie again.
Institutional investors are pouring tons of capital into the ESG space, which has trickle-down effects into early stage businesses, VCs, checkbooks, willingness to take on risk. Consumers are actually paying for sustainability now, and that's provable as opposed to hypothetical as it was before. I'd say, along with countries making big climate commitments, so are corporates, and that should not be belittled. That's actually very significant because they can take on more risk. There are some teeth behind that, right? Shareholders can hold corporates accountable for making those public commitments. And also within the companies, a lot of that enthusiasm is coming from their high quality talent that wants to align their work with climate. It's just interesting that at this point in time, this market is being very much pulled by those corporate commitments versus in prior iterations during kind of 2008, 2009, for example, the thinking was that it would be regulation that stood up and operated a carbon marketplace. That obviously hasn't happened.
All this talk of the buyer's incentives and all that, I think we're overlooking a fundamental question of what those buyers are actually buying. We know that not all tons of removed CO2 are created equal, which means that carbon is far from just another simple commodity to buy or sell.
We spoke to Andrew Shebbear, an angel investor and co-founder of Counteract, which supports carbon removal entrepreneurs.
It's important to remember at the very most basic level, some of us can't even agree what we're buying and selling here. When you say a cost per ton on a voluntary market, how many asterisks do you have to append to that figure to be able to encapsulate all of these subtleties? And in that measure, carbon is unlike any other commodity that's bought and sold today at scale. It's not like gold. The purity of gold is objectively measurable, and it's pretty easy to create a gold exchange. We're in a world here where there are primary questions about the commodity, like how long will it be captured, and how additional was it, and did it have a carbon footprint in itself and its capture? But then also questions about the certainty of its measurement. For example, in soil carbon or forestry, there's just a very wide margin of error, and we don't know how to discount for that. I think that carbon is unlike any commodity that we trade at scale today. And I think not only is the commodity itself surrounded with uncertainty, but that uncertainty in itself is uncertain and is fluid.
Yeah, those complexities we've discussed in previous episodes really come to the fore here. They have real-life implications beyond maybe being just a bit of a headache for whoever's removing the carbon. A ton of CO2 sequestered in a crop or a tree is more susceptible to re-releasing than a ton of CO2 captured with direct air capture, for example, which is then stored underground in geological storage. If I'm buying the promise of 1 ton of carbon safely removed from the atmosphere, I just really want to know that the carbon stays removed, I don't want it going anywhere. Here's Sophie again.
So the fundamental differences in my mind between nature-based solutions and more of these generally mechanical approaches is actually in permanence. And so hypothetically, the market will leverage both, but will price, when this gets to be more of an efficient market, will price differently based off of that difference in permanence. So of course, if you're really paying for the lifetime sequestered value of a carbon unit, that time frame starts to matter a whole lot more as we get more advanced and nuanced with this pricing. So a reforestation credit should hypothetically cost less than a biochar semi-permanent credit, where that carbon is for sure locked up, even if a fire comes and rages through the area where you've stored that tree versus that unit of biochar.
So, how do we build a marketplace that takes that durability into account in the price of the credit, without ending up in a situation where everyone just buys the less permanent options of storage because they're cheaper?
Well, who knows, Tom? Maybe companies will be keen to pay the larger upfront cost of a more permanent solution, rather than the repeated cost of more temporary carbon stores. In which case, investors might start to show more interest in the permanent solutions. I mean, nobody knows exactly how the marketplace might treat permanence, and it's kind of interesting to zoom out and reflect on the knock-on consequences of that.
Really, permanence is just one of so many factors that we need to take into account when we're consolidating all of this into one number, that cost per ton or cost per credit. Andrew tells us more.
So permanent's always better, right? I'd rather a channel had 10,000 or 1,000 year permanence than not. But there's also value in buying time, right? Not all channels need to be 1,000-year permanent. If we can lock away carbon for 100 years, that gives us some time to decarbonize industry and society, and also to invent better ways to remove and store carbon. So, I'd take 100-year permanence in a lot of situations right now, but I wouldn't take 10 years because it's too short to be useful. If I were to capture something for 10 years and then have to buy the credit again in 10 years, I would therefore discount that entirely. I would also much rather have 1 ton locked away for 100 years than 10 tons locked away for 10 years right now. And the shape of that curve, I could scribble my curve, but I imagine would be open to a lot of interpretation and subjectivity. There is not an agreed price for permanence yet. And I think there isn't an agreed discount for measurability, for example. So we know, for example, that there's very wide measurement uncertainty around soil carbon, for example. It's likely that ocean-based solutions will, for the foreseeable future, have significant margin of error applied to their measurability because of the size, the scale, scope of the oceans. We know that counterfactuals can be very difficult in forestry. So I think a lot of these channels are going to really, really struggle to prove that they're 100% additional or that they're, X% measurable. And that certainly doesn't mean we should discount them, but it does mean we have to figure out some way to price for all of this. And at the moment, that's just not done. It's not something I lay at anybody's door in particular. It's not necessarily just a verification problem. It's not necessarily just the exchanges problem. Markets are able to adjust and to internalize this sorts of complexity. I don't think we have yet in carbon. I think we have a long way to go. But actually, when there's enough money and enough interest or enough regulatory pressure, and we certainly need more of that, people will have to pay attention, get educated. We will start to standardize the information that we exchange that describes the quality of a carbon credit, and we will be able to price and trade on these factors.
There's so much for the buyers and sellers to consider here within each of those factors. It feels like the price should reflect the overall quality of the credit somehow.
Yeah, there's loads going on here. It is encouraging to hear Andrew use the word yet, like we're not there yet, but maybe we could be. And he seems to believe it's a possibility. That gives me hope. Can we just talk briefly about the concept of counterfactuals and additionality to get this straight?
Sure. Andrew mentioned them here as complications that we need to be aware of.
Yes, so complicated, in fact, that they deserve a little moment of their own. Counterfactuals look to estimate whether the overall impact of an offset is actually climate positive or not. They ask the question, what would have happened in another scenario? If we'd have done this differently, would the impact have been better? For instance, if we're using a hectare of land to plant a forest, we might think that that's the best case scenario, but maybe that land was actually more suited to be used in a different way, which might have had a better carbon impact. That's the counterfactual. As I said, counterfactuals are estimates. We have no idea what would have happened, so we can only make our best measurements. Additionality is when a project that reduces greenhouse gases in our atmosphere would not have happened if it weren't for the buyer in the market. Is a project having a positive climate impact, or is it taking credit for positive climate impacts that are already happening regardless? An example of this would be if you already own land that has a forest on and you claim carbon credits for that forest. You are never going to cut down that forest anyway, so it's not additional climate benefit. Companies such as Google will look for additionality when investing in offset projects. They want to make sure that that investment is going towards a project that wouldn't have happened otherwise. If their money wasn't there, that offset project wouldn't have taken place.
I feel like we went into one of your mini language chats just there, Emily. But no, you're right. There's a lot of potential for greenwashing, especially with that last one. And I think it's really good to have these on our radar.
A particularly notable example of how this can just go so very wrong comes in the form of a scandal in California, California's Forest Carbon Offsets Program. This incident was written up earlier this year by Carbon Plan, and we'll post the link in the show notes. It's a really interesting read. But essentially, it comes down to 30 million tons of overcrediting. That has a value of $410 million. That's over 29% of California's forest carbon offsets overcredited. 29% of California's forest carbon offsets.
That's so much. That's a third.
Yeah.
That's so dangerous.
One last point I want to make here is about traceability. As a consumer, if a company is claiming to be carbon neutral, net zero emissions, whatever, I want to know where they're getting their credits from, so I can actually see for myself if they're having the climate impact that they claim that they are having. With all of the layers that we've spoken about, it feels like transparency is just essential. Otherwise, I'm putting a lot of trust in these companies that are making these claims. I'm not the only one who's worried about this. Andrew also had something to say.
The fact that they are being maligned right now is a sign that they're not perfect yet. But how could they be? I mean, we're at the beginning. And there are an awful lot of things that are wrong with carbon markets and offset programs in the world today. And none of those things are a sign that we should stop doing carbon removal, that we should not have offset programs, that we should not have carbon markets. They are all signs that we are at the very beginning of this transition. That brings me also to sort of the scandals that have beset a lot of offset programs recently in the US, but also, worldwide. Questions about additionality, questions about double selling, questions about counterfactuals. All of these are very disappointing. They're sad to read, and some of them are more than saddening, they're angering to read. But I also think they should be expected. We are in a market that is completely unregulated, that is going through an explosive year-on-year growth, which everyone agrees is going to continue to explode, in trading a commodity that isn't easily quantifiable or measurable. So of course there are going to be problems. Some of these incidents make me much more angry than others, and some smell very strongly of greenwashing, and some smell much more of kind of well-meaning, but a little bit rough around the edges. I am trying to be philosophical, though, that these are the hallmarks of a nascent marketplace that needs engaged and committed and informed participants, buyers and sellers, to make it work and to make it mature. I hope, and this feels like a really important moment, I hope that these problems make people pay more attention, not less attention, to offsets and carbon markets and carbon removal, and just realize, actually, I can't just expect to tick a box and add a couple of dollars to the price of my flight and have a free conscience, clear conscience. If that seemed like it was too easy, well, it was. It's not that simple.
Andrew really hits the nail on the head with those last couple of sentences. A simple, scandal-free carbon marketplace just sounds too good to be true. This is not an impossible task, and let's remember how essential this is going to be to the carbon removal businesses. But as Sophie talked about, this marketplace is currently corporate-led, and the policy side is lagging behind. Andrew explained why we can't just leave it to the market to generate buyers. We need government intervention to get this going.
I'm a huge proponent of market-based solutions in general, and I think in carbon removal specifically as well. That said, I also very much believe we are going to need very, very strong government intervention if this stuff is going to work. And that intervention needs to be firm and very, very clear and decisive. And again, it's going to need to get into the detail to make sure that it's well directed. I think particularly as corporate buyers, there are exemplars out there to follow. The more you buy, the more intelligent you buy, the more the prices will go up, the more the programs will continue to grow, the more innovation then will come into the space, the more the poor quality will get shown up, and ultimately the more this system will heal itself. The more the government does to help that by increasing carbon taxes, deploying cap and trade programs, managing international fraud, and creating very, very clear standards across the board, the more all of that will be accelerated.
Question for the room. How comfortable are we feeling that corporations are leading the way on this? It doesn't really sit well with me, if I'm honest. I just worry about where it could lead. In fact, even now, a lot of corporations are only buying credits as a way to achieve net zero emissions without reducing their actual emissions. So is it all just offsetting greenwashing rubbish?
Posing the big questions here, Emily. So essentially, yes, but also no.
That's crystal clear. Thanks for that, Tom.
Well, on the one hand, there are some companies that are leading the way that are doing really great things. You could think of a Stripe or a Microsoft. A perfect example is Shopify. They want to help kickstart the market for carbon removals, and they're doing this by investing $5 million a year into carbon removal businesses. And now what's interesting is that they've actually uncoupled that fund from their corporate, i.e. net zero targets, which allows them to spend that 5 million in the most impactful way possible.
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. It's awesome to see what's coming out of some of those companies. And on the other hand, you do have some companies which are undoubtedly just trying to look good, but actually don't necessarily care so much of the quality of credits that they're buying, or maybe even are buying credits as an excuse, as you say, not to focus on decarbonising themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm afraid of.
Now, there's plenty of debate as to what's the best way to go about doing all of this. One method or guide that really stands out here is the Oxford Offsetting Principles. These are a set of guidelines which make sure that offsetting is being done right. The 4 principles that they outline are: 1. Cut emissions and use high quality offsets and regularly revise your offsetting strategy as the best practices evolve. 2 is to shift to exclusively carbon removal offsetting. 3 is to shift to long-lived storage, so more on that permanent side of things. And finally, given that high-quality offsets are still very much in their infancy, the 4th and final point they make is to support the development of net zero aligned offsetting. And this is really to ensure or increase the integrity of this industry. Now, there's so much more that we can say on all of this, and it is a super important part of the discussion, which we're going to come back to in future episodes. But for now, let's remember that carbon marketplaces are key to the success of carbon removal businesses, and we need them if we're going to get those parts per million numbers down.
We got this. We can do it.
We can do it. Using carbon marketplaces to drive negative emissions is one way to make this whole space financially viable and to get businesses and consumers to pay for the cost of removing carbon from the atmosphere, which is like exactly what we're trying to figure out. But there's another side that we need to discuss. We spoke to 2 founders whose companies don't simply sequester that carbon, but do something productive with it. Arpurav Sinha of Carbon Upcycling Technologies and Rob Neven of Carbon Cure. Rob suggested that we think about this whole process in this way.
There's no climate benefit in capturing CO2. You got to do something with it. Otherwise, you just continue to capture it and vent it, which of course has a negative carbon penalty because of the energy that's used to process the CO2 from whatever your starting point is. So I look at the world in both capture and what you do with it. So that could be something called utilization or something similar called sequestration. And it can be permanent or temporary.
Most of the technologies we've looked at in the previous episodes focus on the process of capturing that carbon itself. And in the case of geological sequestration, storing it deep underground. But what Rob is touching on here is utilization.
Right. If we can create a product out of that captured carbon, a product that people want and need, it's easy to see how carbon removal can start to pay for itself. And in a world of finite resources, it also makes sense. Why shouldn't we put this carbon to good use? After all, carbon is a basic building block of life. It's practically in everything, including the air. It's actually everywhere.
It's everywhere. And there's a huge amount of creativity in this space at the moment. Thinking back to some of the products that we were looking at the top of this episode, it's clear that people are finding all sorts of ways to put carbon into practically everything, as you say, Emily.
Yeah, they were some cracking examples. Very imaginative. But I do wonder if many of these represent more of like sort of a gimmick than a real solution, you know? How much demand is there for carbon sequestered clothing and stationery? Even if a significant number of producers in these industries were putting captured carbon into their products, is there really much capacity here? Particularly at a time when we need to be reducing the impact that things like consumer goods and clothing are making on the environment. We just don't want to be pumping out more and more products that are just going to be quickly used and discarded.
You touch on a really good point here. And to be honest, I think a major role that these examples play is actually to show us what can be done. They are a great example of innovation and provide, good press for carbon removal in general. But I do agree, we need to recognise that there's probably a limit to the amount of carbon that we can store in, diamonds or fountain pens. And also ask whether these examples are really having a climate positive impact across their whole supply chain.
Well, Tom, diamonds are forever. So I imagine that permanence wouldn't be an issue in that particular instance.
I do like the idea of having a diamond made from captured carbon.
What would you do with it? Just like sit it on your shelf and look at it?
I don't know, just like there's something quite romantic about it, in a weird way.
Romance isn't dead,
Today, however, we've chosen to look at some slightly less glamorous examples of pretty ubiquitous products with impressive potential. Rob Neven, who we briefly heard from a moment ago, is the founder and CEO of Carbon Cure, which is pioneering processes to sequester carbon into concrete. Yes, that's concrete. He explained to us what concrete is, why there's so much of it, and why it's such a big part of our emissions.
The industry that we work in is concrete production. It's the second most abundant man-made material on the planet, second only to drinking water, and it is the primary building material for everything around us. You can reach concrete from anywhere you're standing, except maybe in a forest. So a very abundant product with a heavy carbon footprint. Cement is often interchanged with concrete, but they're very different. As far as I know, no one in history has ever built anything out of cement. They've only built things out of concrete, which is the product which includes cement, water, aggregates or rocks, gravel if you will, and some performance enhancing chemicals. And typically the focus has been on cement, where really we need to be looking at the whole value chain. And at the end of the day, it's the actual product that's being used. And by doing that, it gives you some new ways of looking at climate solutions and give you a scope of the impact of this industry, which represents about 8% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an awful lot.
8% of global emissions. That's a huge chunk.
Yeah, tell me about it. It's worth noting that, as ever, these figures look a bit different depending on how you calculate them. But there's no doubt that cement and concrete are huge contributors to our greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually more so than other famous emitters like aviation or even shipping.
And cement and concrete aren't the same thing. That's useful to know for when I start my career in concrete or cement.
Well, you're going to need some concrete when you build your direct air capture facility in your garden. But cement is the constituent part of concrete that actually causes most of its emissions. Rob went on to explain why this presents a challenge to the decarbonisation of the industry.
The cement industry emissions are not due to energy. That's a really, really important point, because people think, well, I'm going to solve climate, so I'm going to decarbonize energy. I'm going to put up solar panels and windmills. That's going to have a very limited impact on the CO2 intensity or the emissions that come from some heavy industries like steel and especially cement. So what I'm getting at here is that the cement feedstock that makes concrete is the principal contributor to the carbon footprint of concrete. And then if you think about the scale of the concrete industry, there's so much of it that's produced is like anything that you were to make at that scale is going to have an enormous carbon footprint. But because of this cement manufacturing process, that's mostly process emissions. It's something called calcination, which is the chemical process of turning limestone into something that's called clinker. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking calcium carbonate and we're removing CO2, as we know as carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas. So we're actually breaking that molecule into two pieces. I shouldn't say we, it's the cement companies that are doing this. And what happens is you start off with, let's say, a kilogram of limestone, and then you end up having half a kilogram of clinker and half a kilogram of CO2. So that's actually a lot of CO2 with that ratio. Energy is only about a third of the emissions of cement, and it's the energy that's used to heat the kilns and grind the clinker into cement. There's lots of solutions on how to attack the energy piece. It's the calcination piece, which is the real challenge. Accounts for 2/3 of the emissions of concrete.
So it's a big deal. Decarbonising our energy sector is still going to leave 2/3 of concrete emissions. Rob's actually making the case for carbon removal in general here. We've always said that although energy makes up the majority of our emissions, these industrial processes are going to be hard to decarbonize, and that's one of the reasons we need ways to remove those residual emissions from our atmosphere.
Right, but how can we take this polluting industry and turn it into something climate positive?
Well, whereas concrete usually requires a significant amount of cement to be structurally sound, Carbon Cure is substituting some of that for a mineralized form of CO2. Now, this reduces the amount of cement and its associated emissions needed in the production of concrete, and also allows them to store carbon dioxide in a form where it won't leak back into the atmosphere. Let's hear again from Rob.
So we're agnostic on how it's captured. That's not our part of the job. And there's a lot of different ways you can get CO2. There's actually an entire industry today that captures CO2 and uses it for soda drinks and beer and food and beverage. And that's the CO2 that we use today. That's typically from post-industrial sources like ethanol plants and ammonia plants. So we use CO2 however we can get it. And then we focus on what to do with it and how to create value from it. And there's no better place of doing that than the concrete industry. Concrete has a lot of benefits going for it on why it makes a great ally in decarbonization. One of them is permanence. So we use CO2 in the concrete manufacturing process, so it's permanently mineralized. And then the concrete, of course, is then used to build bridges and roads and schools and high rises and everything you can imagine. And the CO2 is then permanently stored away as a mineral so that it will never be re-released again. So I think when you're looking at climate impact, you need to be thinking a lot about permanence. Another thing is scale. Like if you were to take all other man-made products combined, it still doesn't add up, like outside of water. So it's huge. And it's also pre-processed, ready for maximum reactivity. All this trouble that went into, creating this very reactive material, cement, that you spent so much energy to draw the CO2 out of it. So if you understand thermodynamics, that means it's really wants to go back to its home state. So it's thermodynamically motivated to suck up a lot of CO2, and it does that exothermically. So it actually means that it releases energy. It doesn't require energy to run that reaction.
So I can see a few benefits here. First up is our good old pal permanence. This has sort of been the holy grail of this series so far, and this process feels like it's winning major points here. The second thing is capacity. As we mentioned, there's probably a limit to how many pens or hoodies or diamonds or shoes or soap bars or whatever you can make with captured carbon. But we use so much concrete. We could just keep going forever.
Emily, we use so much. In fact, here's a stat.
Love a good stat.
Global concrete production is in the region of 10 billion tons a year. That is, yes, billion with a B.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah, it's big. And we live in a world with a growing population which is becoming ever more urbanized, with increasing development, bigger cities, bigger buildings. So future capacity shows no signs of slowing down here.
You know what it is? Dialogue around sustainability often comes up against this problem. How do you allow for continued development and the increase in quality of life that brings, especially for less economically developed societies, whilst mitigating climate change and environmental damage? We don't want to go back to the Stone Age in order to fix the problems that we've made. If we really could find a less carbon-intensive way to produce our most ubiquitous building material, that would certainly be a start.
So Carbon Cure's mission statement is to be saving 500 million tonnes of embodied carbon emissions every year by 2030. And that is the equivalent of taking 100 million cars off the road. That's pretty impressive if they get there.
That is super impressive. I do wonder though, we know that there are all sorts of other emissions that come from the construction process. Obviously, as things stand, we need concrete for all the buildings and infrastructure that Rob was mentioning. But overall, this feels like a step in the right direction rather than a ready-made solution to our carbon problem.
I'd agree with that. And from Carbon Cure's perspective, they're really interested in the decarbonisation of the concrete industry. And this involves an element of carbon utilization in the process. But it's really important to note that this doesn't make their overall process carbon negative or even carbon neutral. It's worth noting that Carbon Cure have lowered their impact in other ways though as well. such as purchasing enough clean energy to cover their entire annual operational consumption. But you're right, construction is still a complicated process with a lot of emission sources, and this isn't a complete solution by any means. Not yet, at least.
Yeah, and this is, of course, a developing industry. Many of these technologies are in their very early stages, and while we need quick solutions, we also need that experimentation and innovation that might lead to, truly world-changing technologies in the future. How exciting is that going to be?
It's going to be really exciting. And in fact, we've also managed to speak with another company who's working in this space called Carbon Upcycling Technologies. And they're taking just that kind of experimental approach. Their founder and CEO, Arpurav Sinha, explained what they do.
So carbon upcycling has been scaling a process to mineralize carbon emissions into a whole range of abundantly available solid powders. So what I mean by that is we can take some natural minerals that you can mine from the earth. They're considerably more abundant than some of the other minerals that you might think about, like rare earth minerals, for example, or nickel or copper. And so the idea was to find something that's ubiquitous around the world, but we've also been looking at industrial byproducts. So materials like slag that's produced from smelting of steel, or ash that is produced from coal power when you burn coal. And essentially what we found is that we have this versatile technology where we can plug a range of these different materials, like up to about 20 or so far that we found, and chemically activate these powders so that they can actually absorb CO2 like a sponge would water.
Carbon upcycling technologies begin with any one of a number of readily available powder feedstocks. And these could be anything from abundant materials in the earth like a talc or graphite, or they could be waste materials like fly ash or crushed glass. They then process these in a low energy pressurized reactor so that they can absorb the CO2, which has been captured from a point source of emissions. The result is a number of CO2 enhanced additives which have industrial or manufacturing uses. Like Rob, Arpurav also sees concrete as one area where this could make a big difference.
In terms of construction, we've probably moved as far along as with any of these commercial endeavors. We've found that with fly ash or some of these other minerals that we've been working with, we can reduce the amount of cement that you could use in concrete. So, last summer, during the construction season in Calgary, we did 6 field trials, and we found that we were the only company that has a commercial offering now that can actually reduce cement use in concrete by double digits, so by 10 or 20%. And that's pretty significant when, if you're talking about cutting down 8% of global emissions, like hypothetically speaking, by 10%, you're almost doing, a 1% reduction in global emissions.
Concrete seems to be a bit of a theme in this utilisation space, and it's easy to see why. It's also a double whammy, because you're reducing the need for polluting cement and finding a permanent way of storing that captured CO2. Oh, I love it when you get double benefits from things. But I was also struck by some of the other products the company's been developing. Anti-corrosion coatings, plastics, and more. Arpurav talked about one example that's really captured his imagination.
Probably the most kind of eye-catching example that I love to bring up, just because I personally find it quite meaningful, is some of the nanomaterials that we've made through this process are actually being tested at the University of Waterloo for use in pharmaceutical drug delivery. And it's not something we really talked about too much recently, but about 2 years ago, we did some in vitro testing. So this is like test tube testing with cancer cells. And what we did was we took a regular cancer drug, and the research group found that if they can load a graphene oxide molecule, which is made through our process, with this drug, it allows it to be a lot more efficient and potent in terms of delivering that drug to the cancer or the tumor cell in the test tube setup. So, I'm sure that even as of a couple of years ago, if you told people that you can take a pollutant, make it into a nanomaterial that then helps carry a drug, like acts as a vehicle for a drug delivery mechanism to tackle tumors like lung cancer tumors or pancreatic cancer and things like that. Like it's kind of a mind-boggling example of circular economy in action. And lo and behold, I mean, there's potential that this could help and like meaningfully change therapy for like just cancer treatment around the world. But there's a significant chance that despite the developments that we made over the last 4 years, it could still fall to the wayside. But the fact that it has been able to show enough interest at a research level to keep going for 4 or 5 years, at the very least adds knowledge to the space. And in the best case scenario, still has potential to make a meaningful difference in health sciences.
As he says, this is still in its early stages, and we can't know whether this particular product will ever even make it to market. But my big takeaway from this is that this is an incredibly exciting space. We're only just beginning to realise some of the possibilities. Who knows what the future could look like? But even if just a fraction of the technologies that companies like Revolves are developing, if just a tiny fraction of those are deployed at scale, we can really imagine a world in which captured carbon is put to all sorts of uses that are going to benefit us and the planet, and it's going to be beautiful.
It's exciting for sure, and alongside the immediate potential to store that carbon, there are several potential side benefits, both for the carbon removal industry and for specific businesses. When we spoke to Rob Neven, he explained that for the industrial grade CO2 they're using, they're used to paying between $200 to $500 a tonne, and at that price, there's a real economic incentive for all sorts of carbon capture approaches and more expensive technologies like DAC to start to seem more viable.
Yeah, right, that could be a game changer. We can start to see more of the differentiation of these different removal methods that we've looked at. Afforestation might be a lot cheaper than DAC, for example, and have a host of other important benefits, but it doesn't offer us the chance to use that captured carbon in the sorts of ways that we've just been talking about here. These utilisation approaches could help bring these costs down, as well as to drive further innovation and scaling of the removal technologies themselves.
And for businesses who buy these products, there may even be the possibility of additional revenue. Carbon Cure's customers, for example, may be able to generate carbon removal credits from the concrete they use, which could really help drive the rollout of this technology.
I think we're beginning to see how carbon marketplaces and utilisation could come together to answer that question of who's going to pay for carbon removal.
So, Emily, what came up for you in this episode?
A few things, Tom, you'll not be surprised to hear. From the carbon marketplace's perspective, there's just so much complexity, and there needs to be a sort of a close eye kept on all of that to ensure that we're not just doing this half-heartedly, you know? It feels a bit like it has to be really thoroughly done. Otherwise, doing it might be worse than not doing it at all.
Yeah, it's kind of that phrase which is thrown around sometimes, the dangerous distraction. If we don't nail that regulation, as well as the concept that no tonne is created equal, it's going to be very difficult to make this stand apart from the offset markets that we used to have 15, 20 years ago that have had a lot of controversy.
Right. So how do we account for questions of permanence and immediacy and all the complexities? Complexities has been the word of this episode. All the complexities that we talked about. How do we account for that in a carbon market? I am sure that it can be done. Like, we have complex marketplaces for other things. And I just hope that there's the will to get it done. What about the carbon utilisation side, Tom?
So when we were first doing our research on utilisation, it was really inspiring to see people making, vodka out of carbon that's been captured from the atmosphere, diamonds or something else like that. Now I spend more time in kind of understanding it. I'm understanding that perhaps the impact isn't as great. But again, as we said, just the sheer inspiration that I drew from it, and I think others might draw from seeing these kind of things happen, I think can only be a good thing for carbon removal in general.
Yeah, I agree. I feel very inspired looking at the innovations that are coming out with carbon utilization. The future seems so exciting when you look at this industry that's emerging. But I'm very aware that there's potential in the carbon utilization space to actually undo the good work of trying to make that carbon marketplace very thorough and specific and usable.
And you could argue, is that stepping stone necessary? Or should we just cut it out and just go straight to carbon removal and not put time, money, research hours into this utilization space and just focus on the kind of permanent removal space. There's quite a hot debate about that at the moment, I think, as well.
Yeah, it feels like the carbon utilization is almost like the shiny new toy that attracts your attention. And as long as behind that, it's not, undercutting the fundamental importance of all the other things that we keep mentioning, of permanence and making sure that it's coming hand in hand with reducing carbon emissions. That shiny toy is fine to be there. It just cannot be the essence or the important thing about this.
Do we just draw a strict line and say, look, well, something like cement production, it makes sense there because we need to scale it anyway. But then something like producing T-shirts, we don't need another T-shirt, right?
For sure.
Difficult questions.
But when we're talking about marketplaces, we said we need to scale this up. And so we need more investment, we need more interest, we need regulation in place and policy and everything. The scaling up question, it's an interesting one. So in order to realise this future where we're all surrounded by things made of carbon with an amazingly sturdy carbon marketplace, we need to face that challenge of scaling up. And in the next episode, that's exactly what we'll be talking about.
I'm excited for this one. To make meaningful impact, businesses must focus on both rapidly decarbonising their operations and compensating unavoidable emissions. Fortunately, one of the Carbon Removal Show's sponsors has made it easy for businesses to neutralise their carbon footprint so they can focus on cutting unnecessary emissions altogether.
That's right. Patch is the marketplace for carbon removal. They help companies estimate carbon emissions for certain activities and then neutralise them by purchasing high-quality carbon removal from a portfolio of projects. Patch's project network includes both nature-based projects like forestry, soil and kelp, and cutting-edge technologies like biochar and mineralisation.
Head to patch.io today to find out more. Thank you so much to our team who make this series possible.
Our researcher and fact-checker Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer Reke Campbell.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer Ben Weaver-Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floy.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Carbon Removal Show. As ever, I've been Tom Praviti and I've been joined by Emily Swaddle.
Now that we know how we're going to pay for our carbon removal, next time we'll be asking the question, how do we scale up?
Don't forget to subscribe to the Carbon Removal Show if you haven't already. It really helps us find more listeners like yourselves.
Thank you, we really appreciate it. Head to restored.cc for more information on carbon removal and to sign up to our newsletter. See you next time.
Co-fruition.